No doubt many of you have heard the fictional story written by Washington Irving about Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle was a lazy, henpecked husband in the 1700s who would get away from his work and his responsibilities and the turmoil in his home by taking hikes during the day up in the Catskill Mountains of New York. And one day, Rip was sitting under a tree in the hills, and he was offered a potion by some funny-looking characters in the story, and he fell asleep. And finally, after a long sleep, he wakes up, and his dog is gone, the stock of his gun is worm-eaten, and he has this very long beard. He makes his way down the mountain, and when he enters the village, he sees that it has changed, and he really doesn't recognize anyone. And slowly he begins to realize that he had slept for 20 years. And while he had been sleeping, a revolution had taken place. When people finally realized who he was, he becomes a curiosity to them. He's a curiosity to them as a man who slept through the American Revolution. And the point of the story that Washington Irving is making by writing it was that it was about people who didn't feel like they should get involved in the American Revolutionary War, and so, in a sense, they slept through it. And you know, as I think of that story, can I dare suggest to us today that in the years to come, this church and every one of us who is a part of it has an opportunity to be part of a revolution taking place in people's lives that God wants to do in people's lives. For as you and I grow as Christians, and as our church family continues in this vision that God has called us to, we're going to have an opportunity to minister to people's needs and see people come to faith in Jesus. And if you and I are awake and we're alert and we're open to what God wants to do through us, even if it means being stretched out of our comfort zones, then God will use us to impact Lenexa and Johnson County and this region that we live in, this region here in Kansas City. He'll use us to impact people with the good news of the gospel, the good news about Jesus and his love and his mercy, his grace, his forgiveness of our sin, and the transformed lives that we get to live when Jesus is living within us through the power of his Holy Spirit. But the reality is that if we sleep through these opportunities, then this church family, like Rip Van Winkle, will be nothing more than a curiosity to people in our community, in our region. And so today, I want to share with us, as we conclude this series on Vision 2026, I want to share with us some thoughts on how you and I can be part of a life-changing revolution in people's lives. And to do that, I want us to take a look at a man from the Old Testament of the Bible. His name was Nehemiah. And he's a man who over 2,400 years ago now was able to revolutionize the lives of people in his hometown, as in 50 days he walled in his city as a witness to the glory of God. Now, to help us understand or learn something from him, we need to begin with the background of the story and tell you that in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army destroyed Jerusalem, and they laid waste to the city's walls. And the writer of Lamentations tells how the jackals would sit on the walls and on the rubble, and their wailing calls, Lamentations says, sounded as if they were crying out, "Gone is the glory of Solomon." Gone is the glory of Solomon. And then a number of years later, Persia conquered Babylon. And following that, Azariah and Haggai were allowed to return to their homeland. And they struggled to get the temple rebuilt, but they finally got the temple rebuilt. But Jerusalem was still defenseless without walls. And so around 444 BC, Nehemiah's concern was for the rebuilding of those city walls. And in verses 2 through 4 of chapter 1, we see why when we read this, and you'll see it coming up here on the screen. Hanani, one of my brothers, came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah. And I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and about how things were going in Jerusalem. They said to me, "Things are not going well for those who return to the province of Judah. They are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. And when I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven." Now, why all of that over broken down walls? Well, we need to understand this morning that in that day, if the walls of your city were broken down, not only was it a dangerous thing for the people who lived there, but it was also a disgrace. As in that culture, understand that the walls of a city were a reflection of the God that the people in that city served. That was the culture and that was the thinking in that day. And what that means is if your city walls were strong, it meant that your God was strong. But if your city walls were weak and insignificant, it meant that the God you served was weak and insignificant. And for example, in Babylon, the walls of the city were extra wide, and we know from history they were so wide that 2 chariots could ride and race side by side around the top of the city walls. And as a result, in that day, people would cry out, "Great is Marduk, God of the Babylonians." And so Nehemiah, you see, is not only concerned for the people's safety, he's also grieved that the torn down walls of Jerusalem are a poor witness for God, for Yahweh. And so his desire was to see the city walled up so that there could be a witness to the power of God to be able to save his people. And understanding some of the dynamics of what was going on back then, can we see the spiritual analogy of this to your life, to my life, to the life of Community Covenant Church today? And it is that if we desire to have people in our community, in our city, in our county, in our region know about the power of God to be able to save people from sin, then we need to wall in our community. We need to wall in our county. We need to wall in our city and our region, not with walls of brick and cement, but with walls of witness to others about Jesus and what he's done in our life and how he's forgiven us of our sin and what he can do in their life as well if they will turn to him in faith. Now, if you and I want to impact people, and we want to be able to impact people in our community with our witness for Jesus, not only with our words, as we've been talking about through this series and looking at the idea of bless and the acronym of that, but also by the way we serve people and the way we relate to people, then I want to say to us there, I think there are 3 lessons that we can learn from Nehemiah's experience, 3 lessons that will teach us about how we can wall in our community with witness. And the first lesson is found right there in Nehemiah 1 that Scott read to us earlier. And it is that if we are going to wall in our community with witness, then we must be people who feel the need. We've got to be people who feel the need. I mean, think of Nehemiah and what we read there in chapter 1. He felt the need. Remember how he expressed his feelings about the problem, how he wept, he mourned, he fasted, he prayed. He pours out his heart to God. Verse 4, remember what it said. When I heard this, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned and fasted and prayed to the God of heaven. What he's doing here is he's pouring out his heart to God, and he's reminding God of God's promise to restore his people to Jerusalem if they repented of their sin and changed their ways. And since God was beginning to do that, and he was beginning to restore his people to Israel, he felt this need to be a witness for God in that area by building up the walls. Now I got to tell you that in 444 BC, Nehemiah really did not have to be concerned for Jerusalem. I mean, he didn't have to let that really trouble him, because at that moment in his life, his needs were being met in a big way. You see, Nehemiah is a person who had been in refuge. He had been a refugee, a Jewish refugee there in exile, and he had been lifted out of the ghetto. And because of his leadership ability and because of his strength of personality, he had become the king's cupbearer, which in that day is about the most significant position that you can have in the kingdom. I mean, in that day, in culture, the king's cupbearer didn't just follow around the king with a coffee pot asking him if he wanted it, with black or with cream or sugar, right? I mean, a cupbearer had power and prestige, as the king had to have every confidence in him because he would choose the king's wine, and he, as the cupbearer, would be sure that the wine had not been poisoned. So the king had to have absolute faith and trust in him. And he was always close by the king. He was always relied upon for advice and counsel. He would be something like the Secretary of State today in our government. And so the reality is that Jerusalem's condition and the poor witness that it was for God did not have to deeply affect him and trouble him because he was really well off. But it did bother him. It did affect him. And this morning we see how Nehemiah felt the need to wall in Jerusalem for the witness of God. And as we see that, I want to ask you and me, does it matter to us that our community, our region, our county is not walled in with witness for God? Does it matter to you and me that there are people in Lenexa and Johnson County and beyond and here in Kansas City who need to hear about Jesus, who need to experience forgiveness of sin and a personal relationship with God that comes to us through faith in Jesus? And the reality is that even though we are comfortable in our positions of faith and we're comfortable with knowing the Lord and being in a relationship with Him, do we then feel the need for other people to experience that same thing? I don't know if you realize this. We're doing a Cultivating Deep People segment, it's called. Kelly and Lorraine Rockman are helping Vanessa and me, and 6 times throughout this year, we're meeting with a group of 9 young adults from our church family, and we're doing leadership development with that group of young adults. And it's been an amazing time, hasn't it, Kelly? It's just been a great time together with them. And this last weekend, we got together and we were talking about biographies of people who made a difference, who impacted their world for Jesus. Biographies of people in history and in entertainment and other kinds of biographies. And Kelly and I love biographies. And one of the biographies that I looked at one time was a biography about Dr. George Truett, who was a man who was a famous pastor in our nation. He was the pastor of one of the largest churches in our country at the time, First Baptist Church of Dallas. And he was the pastor there from 1898 to 1944. 46 years he served as pastor of that church. And in the stories that are told about him during his ministry, they said that he would regularly walk the streets of Dallas and was so overwhelmed with the needs of the people in the street who were poor and who were outside of a relationship with Jesus that he was constantly out there helping to meet needs and witnessing to people about the love and the grace and the forgiveness of God for them through Christ. And they say that he was so distracted by the needs he felt deeply that a lot of the times the deacons would have to go out and look for him. They'd have to, if they had a need that the church needed to be tended to by the pastor, they'd have to go look for him out on the streets of Dallas to get him so that he would come back and take care of what needed to be taken care of there in the church. And as I look at that, I think of this guy, I go, wow, is that my passion too? Is that your passion as well? Is that the passion of Community Covenant Church? Or have we become so distracted in our Western American culture by all the opportunities that we have to do this and to do that and to give our lives to, that we aren't really thinking about the needs of others? We aren't thinking about how people around us need Jesus. And I think today that the lesson of Nehemiah for you and for me and for Community Covenant Church, if we want to impact people in our communities for Jesus, if we want to impact the lives of our family members who don't know the Lord, or our friends who don't know the Lord, or our fellow workers, or our classmates at school, or neighbors in our community who don't know Jesus, we have to first be people who feel the need. We have to be like Nehemiah. Nehemiah, who is able to wall in his city with witness for God because he first felt the need. Now, there's a second lesson we learn from Nehemiah's experience, and it is this, that if we are going to wall in our community with witness, then we must be people who rely on God, who is able to give us the resources. We must be people who rely on God, who's able to give us the resources. In chapter 1, Nehemiah realizes he can't do this thing on his own power. And so what does he do? He begins to fast. He begins to pray. He seeks God, who is able to provide the resources by preparing the king's heart and the hearts of the people so that God would open those hearts so that they could do what it is that God would want to do in them and through them. And we see some of that in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Look at again, Nehemiah 1, verses 5 through 11. Then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of unfailing love with those who love him and obey his commands, listen to my prayer. Look down and see me praying night and day for your people Israel. I confess that we have sinned against you. Yes, even my own family and I have sinned. We have sinned terribly by not obeying the commands, decrees, and regulations that you gave us through your servant Moses. Please remember what you told your servant Moses. If you are unfaithful to me, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands and live by them, then even if you are exiled to the ends of the earth, I will bring you back to the place I have chosen for my name to be honored. The people you rescued by your great power and the strong hand are your servants. Oh, Lord, please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those of us who delight in honoring you. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it in his heart to be kind to me. And he says that in those days, I was the king's cupbearer. And then in chapter 2, we see God answering that prayer and providing for the needs that Nehemiah is talking about and praying about. As we see the king looks at Nehemiah, he sees his sadness, he hears his story, and remarkably provides him with both the time and the resources to go rebuild Jerusalem's walls. Listen as I read chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, and you can follow along on the screen behind me. Early the following spring, in the month of Nisan, during the 20th year of King Artaxerxes' reign, I was serving the king wine. I had never before appeared sad in his presence. And so the king asked me, why are you looking so sad? You don't look sick to me. You must be deeply troubled. And then he says, then I was terrified. Why would he be terrified when the king asked him a question? Because understand in that day, if the king doesn't like your answer, he can have you executed immediately. And if the king isn't pleased with you being in their presence, he will take you out. And so Nehemiah says, I was terrified, much like Esther, if you know the story of Esther, was terrified to go see the king. Same deal here. He says, I was terrified, but I replied, long live the king. How can I not be sad? For the city where my ancestors are buried is in ruins, and the gates have been destroyed by fire. And the king asked, well, how can I help you? And with a prayer to the God of heaven, I replied, if it please the king, and if you are pleased with me, your servant, send me to Judah to rebuild the city where my ancestors are buried. The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked, how long will you be gone? When will you return? And after I told them how long I would be gone, the king agreed to my request. Then he really takes a chance. Verse 7, I also said to the king, if it please the king, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, instructing them to let me safely travel through their territories on my way to Judah. And please give me a letter addressed to Asaph, the manager of the king's forest, instructing him to give me the timber. I mean, he's asking for the whole wad at this point. I will need it to make beams for the gates of the temple fortress and for the city walls and for a house for myself. And the king granted these requests because the gracious hand of God was on me. And when I came to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River, I delivered the king's letters to them. The king, I should add, had sent along army officers and horsemen to protect me. Wow. Talk about God answering a prayer and fulfilling the need for the resources. I mean, it was as if Nehemiah had been asked what it would be if he wanted to be king for the day. And when the king gave him an inch, he took a mile. I mean, when the door opened, he walked through it in faith that God would answer his prayer and give him the resources he needed. As I think about that, and I put a spiritual overlay on that for you and me today, I want to say that today, as you and I live life in our homes and in our neighborhoods, in our places of work, and in our schools, there are doors in people's lives that open to us from time to time. And we have the opportunity at that moment to share with them about a relationship with Jesus. And if, like Nehemiah, we recognize that we need to God to give us the ability and the resources to share our lives with faith with each other. And we're praying for that, right? As the BLESS acronym talks about, beginning with prayer. If we do that, when those doors open and we're praying toward that end, God will use us. God will use us to impact others around us for faith in Jesus. And Nehemiah's story teaches us that. Nehemiah teaches us through his example in chapters 1 and 2 that if we pray and we seek God with all our heart and we trust God to be with us, he will provide for us what we need to minister to others with both our actions as well as our words of sharing Jesus with them. Well, finally, at the end of chapter 2 and then in chapters 3 and 4, there's a third lesson we find by looking at Nehemiah's example, and it is this. It is that if we're going to wall in our community with witness, then we've got to be people who are willing to take a risk and do the difficult. At the end of chapter 2, we read the account of how Nehemiah inspected the walls and he mapped out his strategy, and then he began to motivate people to end decades of inaction by seizing the moment and rebuilding the walls. But in order to seize the opportunity and rebuild the walls, they had to be willing to do what you and I in this church family has to be willing to do. If we're going to seize those opportunities that we have to be a witness for Jesus in our community, in our neighborhoods, our places of work, in our schools, in wherever it is that we are, we must be willing to take a risk and do the difficult. In this story of Nehemiah, we see the people willing to take the risk and doing something they'd not done before, and as a result was no doubt out of their comfort zones. I mean, just think about it. Think about the people. Go home and read chapters 2 and 3 and 4, and think about the people there in chapter 3 who are listed, who are rebuilding the walls. These are not like people who are used to getting their hands dirty and used to doing that kind of work. People like Nehemiah, the king's cupbearer, the high priest, and his fellow priests. People like goldsmiths and jewelers and perfume makers and merchants. All kinds of people who had never done that kind of work before, but who are willing to take the risk and do the difficult. Get out of their comfort zone and do what it was that God was wanting them to do. And their motto wasn't the motto of a lot of churches today. You know, there are a lot of churches today who their motto is, hey, come wheel or woe. The only status we know is quo, you know. Or the 7 last words of the church, we never did it that way before. No, God's people in Jerusalem were willing to take a risk and do the difficult thing. And so can I say to us this morning, we need to understand that if we aren't willing to take risks, we are never going to wall in our community with witness. If we're not willing to take risks with people who might think we're a bit crazy, who might reject us, who might even do some pretty mean things to us, if we're not willing to take that risk and get out of our comfort zones, we will never build walls of witness in our community for Jesus Christ. And look at the end of chapter 2 and then in chapter 4, we're going to see how the people building walls, the walls were made fun of and they were scorned and they were even in danger of being physically assaulted by people. by people who are opposed to God and opposed to their faith. Look at a few of these verses. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of my arrival, they were very displeased that someone had come to help the people of Israel. Chapter 2, verse 19. When Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arab heard of our plan, they scoffed contemptuously. What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king? They asked. And then the opposition gets upped even more. Look at chapter 4. Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and he mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they are doing? Do they think they can build the wall in a single day by just offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of the stones from a rubbish heap, and charred ones at that?" And Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, "That stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked along the top of it," right? Let alone the 2 chariots that could ride along the top of the wall in Babylon. Then I prayed, "Hear us, our God, for we are being mocked. And may their scoffing fall back on their own heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land." And then verse 7 of chapter 4. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the work was going ahead and that the gaps in the wall of Jerusalem were being repaired, they were furious. And they all made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion. In verse 11, meanwhile, our enemies were saying, before they know what is happening, we will scoop down on them and kill them and end their work. You know, just as these people in Nehemiah's day faced opposition, we're going to face risk as well of opposition if we choose to say, yeah, we want to be a witness for Jesus out there in our world, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our places of work, in our schools. There are going to be people who will reject us. There'll be people who will lash out at us. But you know, if we are willing to take a risk and do the difficult, God will honor that. And thinking about doing the difficult, I laughed when I read verse 14 of chapter 3. Look at it as it comes up on the screen behind me. The dung gate, he says. The dung gate was repaired by Malchijah, son of Rechab, the leader of Beth Hakkarim district. He rebuilt it and set up its doors and installed its bolts and bars. And can I say, you and I don't need a PhD in Hebrew to figure out that it wasn't pleasant work to rebuild the dung gate. A gate where people piled all their manure and the garbage for a city with thousands of animals and people in it in a very hot and sunny climate. But someone had to accept the assignment of rebuilding the dung gate, even though it would have been a lot more or a lot less difficult and a lot more fun to work on the Golden Gate or the Eastern Gate or the Fountain Gate. And look at Nehemiah 4, 15 through 23. When our enemies heard that we knew of their plans and that God had frustrated them, we all returned to our work on the wall. But from then on, only half my men worked, while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stationed themselves beyond the people of Judah, or behind the people of Judah, who were building the wall. The laborers carried on their work with one hand supporting their load and one hand holding a weapon. And all the builders had a sword belted to their side. The trumpeter stayed with me to sound the alarm. And then I explained to the nobles and officials and all the people, the work is very spread out and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. When you hear the blast of the trumpet, rush to wherever it is sounding, and then our God will fight for us. And we will work early and late from sunrise to sunset. And half the men were always on guard. And I told everyone living outside the walls to stay in Jerusalem. And that way they and their servants could help with guard duty at night and work during the day. And during this time, none of us, not I, nor my relatives, nor my servants, nor my guards who were with me, ever took off our clothes. And we carried our weapons with us at all times, even when we went for water. And I want to say to us as we read that does not mean that if you and I are going to wall in our community with witness, we need to be carrying around a 9mm with us, for people that oppose us. But think about how they came alongside each other and how they helped one another and how they encouraged one another and how they were there to help protect each other. And I think of that, and I think of us as we get out there in our world and we share the good news of the gospel and we face opposition. We need each other for encouragement. We need to be able to come together and say, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. Would you pray for me? Would you help? Would you help me to have strength and courage to do this work? And in this way, I think that if we are going to wall in our community with witnesses, people, and as a church, then we've got to not only set aside our pride and our ego and our comfort zone and our agendas, but we've got to be willing to encourage one another and come along and support each other. And to be able to not only be out there in the world on our own, but to be out there with the help of one another, with the help of our church. And so as we think about this and as we conclude this series, I want to ask us again, how do we do this? What are the action steps? Well, the action steps, I believe, are what we've been talking about these last few weeks. As our action step is this ministry goal that the people of community will lead others to find and follow Jesus by blessing their neighbors. And that word bless is the acronym that if you've been around here the last few weeks or if you've been around here for a while, because we've been using this acronym for quite a long while, is the idea that we will begin with prayer. And that we will begin as Nehemiah did and begin to pray that God would provide the resources that we need to be able to share with others and begin to pray for people and pray who God would lead us to. And then when we get to be with people who don't know the Lord, we begin to listen to their concerns and we listen with care to the needs they have in their life. And maybe, as we've said, we invite them over to the house for a meal, or we go out to eat at a restaurant with them, or take them out for coffee and we eat together. And while we're doing that, we're listening to their story, and then we find out if there are needs they have that we can serve them with love. And as we do that, we earn the right with people to be able to share our story with them. And so I want to encourage you, if you've not yet picked up one of these bookmarks that we gave out a few weeks ago, where you can begin to write down the names of people who you would want to pray for, at each of the exits today, we have some more of these. Pick one of those up if you've not yet done this, and take it home and begin to pray. Begin to pray that God would open up your heart to who it is that He would want you to be ministering to. And as you do that, think about Nehemiah's example that we've seen this morning, and how if we are going to wall in our neighborhoods and community and county and city with witness and have an impact on people with the good news, then we must first feel the need to reach out to those around us who are spiritually lost and who need God's forgiveness and grace. We must then look to God in prayer for the resources and the strength and the ability to do so. And then we must be willing to seize the opportunities we have each day in our homes with our families and in our neighborhoods and at school and at work, by being willing to take a risk and do the difficult. And I want to ask us, are we willing to be like Nehemiah? Or are we willing to be like what the Apostle Paul calls Epaphroditus in Philippians 2:30? He calls Epaphroditus there one of God's gamblers. One of God's gamblers. One of God's risk takers. Will you and I, and will Community Covenant Church, be a Nehemiah? Be an Epaphroditus. Be one of God's risk takers in this world in which you and I live, and where we are called to share Jesus with others.